Nothing ready? Okay, we got Pat Tracy. All right, there we go.
Testing.
Is it on? Green?
Okay. Woo-hoo. Pat Tracy with Reach.
Thank you.
Testing.
There we go.
DJ, if we could turn the music off, we're ready to go.
Oh, let's do it with music. So, Pat Tracy with Reach. Where do you start with a progressive idea such as you have been in a very conservative environment, which is what we're in?
Yeah. Does everybody hear a question?
No.
She said, where do you start in a conservative environment versus a progressive environment, which is like Minneapolis, St. Paul? And I mean, I have a simple formula, like I said before, but it's basically you got to have a couple of, I call them courageous leaders, and ideally, and again, I'm not saying it's easy, but ideally, 2 or 3 courageous leaders from different sectors, ideally unusual bedfellows, and so. And I get it. You create in Florida in particular, you have this environment that DeSantis has been able to create such a environment of fear. So finding those courageous people is even harder. But I do think it starts with a couple of people basically saying, I'm going to use the power I have from the institution I control. I mean, the great thing about Minneapolis, St. Paul is that Tanya Allen, who's the head of McKnight, basically had McKnight behind her, as well as her board. Like they hired this Black woman 8 months after George Floyd was killed, and they had to know what they were getting, And so, but Tanya didn't have to use all of her personal agency, so she called that, number 2 at US Bank and said, what do you think of this? The mayor, think of this. So it really is this kind of, you create this network of 2 or 3 folks. And, we started designing it, I'd say September of 2021. And we didn't actually announce that we were going to do anything till May of 2022. And it was that period of time that she and others used to kind of build this initial coalition that was centered around ambition, not idea. It was like, we're going to build something that's going to be huge. And like they initially said, it'll be a couple $1 million. And I said, no, it's going to be 2 billion. And Tanya's like, oh God, 2 billion. And then after we did the work, it was like, no, it's actually 5 billion, but that's the long answer to your short question.
Thank you. Charlie Van Dyke with the Atlanta Fed Miami branch. Thank you so much. And that was really inspiring. I had a question with a regulator hat on, which is, can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about communicating those groundbreak aligned bank loans and the guarantees that are coming from philanthropy so that it fits the credit box of regulators? And then to say, when you have that story, let's share that story together.
Yeah. So there's a couple of answers to that. One of them is, and this won't surprise most people in the room, but when we went to, we actually have launched this system with homeownership as an early implementation because we got that money in October. Much of it was grants, and we said, well, let's put that into that model for homeownership. But we needed at least 2 banks that would agree to those basic terms because otherwise it's not a new system. So we got 4. And those 4, though, tell the story that I think answers your question. One of them had a special purpose credit program already approved. And they're just like, well, we approved it for 50 people and we'll expand it to whatever, 1,000, right? And then on the other extreme, there was like, we'll design our own program. That was more of a regional bank that could do that as opposed to a national bank, but like, we'll build it ourselves. But pretty much the 2 in the middle essentially said, we have products that are not that far from that. We just don't really market them. And so we're going to be a part of it. But none of them felt that they needed to get regulatory approval because it wasn't really far from what they're already doing. And that's what's so unbelievably frustrating about this work, is that many of these products exist in your markets. They're either too hard to find, or like the black people, the black folks who are in our working groups, they're like, they may have that product, but I don't trust them to save my life. So I'm not walking in there even if they gave me $50,000. You know, so the trust and having the multiple banks around the table was a critical part of it.
Hi, I'm Jamie Lee Bradshaw. I'm the coordinator for the NeighborWorks Florida Collaborative. We are 12 organizations across the state trying to amplify our impact through partnerships, and that's what I kept hearing today.
Yep.
I thank you for the caution of not chasing the shiny penny. In Palm Beach County, where I live, we have 8,000 registered nonprofits.
Yeah, great.
And I call it the Hunger Games because
yeah.
everyone is trying to identify the shiny penny. But I would like some guidance on how we can go back to our communities
Mhm.
and challenge our funders to not fund the shiny penny.
Yeah.
Because the more we continue to identify new and innovative programming, and then as we get to implement, then here comes another shiny penny from someone else. It draws the attention away from the funder, and we don't have time to build stability, evaluation metrics, or anything. So it's very interrelated, and some guidance would be appreciated.
Great question. And so ideally, I'll talk about the ideal first and then go down to maybe reality. So the ideal thing would be that there would be a courageous funder who would be the first person, you know, so you know how there's right now, one of the movements in philanthropy, maybe too strong a word, but trust-based philanthropy is sort of a thing right now, right? It'll go away. But right now, people are talking about trust-based philanthropy. Well, that's because a couple of funders started talking about it, right? And so to the extent that you can get one or more funders to say, you know, we really want to do this. So, and a good example of not this per se, but of the model is like, so when we started, one of the things I and my wife would say, I can't keep a job, but I started a nonprofit with Michelle knows well, Ray Ramsey. Ray and I started this organization called One Economy to get broadband into the homes of people all over the globe, and then content they could use. It was in 2000, so we were way ahead of our time. It's not good to be ahead of your time, but and now I got off on a tangent and I forget what I was telling you about. But on funders, that when we were looking for money to do that work in One Economy, we went to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and they had at the time, I don't think they have it anymore, which is too bad, but they had a part of RWJ, which was called the Pioneer Fund. And it was like, I forget what it was, 1%, 5%, small, maybe 1 or 2% of every year. They just put in the Pioneer Fund, and they're like, you don't have to meet our giving guidelines. You, Pioneer Fund, go look for what we should be doing tomorrow. You know, look over the landscape. So the idea doesn't have to be that foundations don't ever do the new thing, but put some guardrails around it and say, we're going to acknowledge that innovation doesn't help scale. So this foundation might say, we're now going to change our giving. So 80%, pick a number, is going to go to scaling things, and we're going to have criteria to figure out what those are. 20% will go to innovation, or it'll, you know, change over time. But that really could be a key way to do it. They basically, like, they follow each other. Foundations are not different than everybody else. They don't want to be first, but they don't want to be last.
Thank you, Ren. I am so glad to see you, and that was very, very just helpful. One thing I wanted to just ask you for, because I know that you've done a lot of national work, is that when we do hear Portland or Seattle or I have noticed more in the South, and especially in Florida right now in the political reality, it feels pretty hopeless.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted you to touch on the fact, because I know your history, I know what you've done in the country. It has happened incrementally everywhere.
Of course.
And
yeah.
so give us a couple of examples that would be great.
Well, I mean, so that's why that idea of the arc is really important. It just, you don't want to, it's hard to see the arc when you're like at the bottom. And you know what, I'm gonna mix analogies, but it's hard to have perspective when you're like worried about the day to day, no question about it. So that's a given. However, these things take time. And so I was at a meeting, I think it was at the White House actually, under maybe the end of Obama. And the head of the Ford Foundation before Darren Walker, Luis Urbinez, if anybody knows Luis. Somebody asked that question about like philanthropy, you know, and change and has it happened? And Luis said, okay, how many people here love Seattle, the city of Seattle, like in the room? And people are, oh, I love Seattle, it's a great city. Like, how many people here love New York? I love New York, whatever it is. How many people would have said that in 1974? For either of those cities? Nobody. Right? And so the reality is those places have completely turned around over a long period of time. And that was, you know, whenever that was, still it was maybe 15 years ago then. So over a 30-year period, those places completely turned around. They're unrecognizable from what they were in 1974 or 1976. So that is the truth, you know. And the reality is that if you look at even in Florida, so like a friend of my wife's family is Southern, and for some reason they knew Bob Graham, right? He was governor, right, and senator. So they knew Bob Graham, and so I met Bob Graham years ago, not through work, but through my wife's family. And like he was governor of Florida. And now DeSantis is, it's going to happen again, right? It just changes. And the question is, how do you not A, lose hope, and B, not have all of your gains wiped out by, you know, the Darth Vader? And the reality is that it is hard to wipe out all the gains, right? Like even DeSantis can't wipe out all the gains. And that's the trouble with changing systems. When you want to change them for the worse, you can't change them that fast. And when you want to change for the better, you can't change them that fast either. But I do think the Graham DeSantis is a pretty good thing to think about when you live in Florida.
Thank you very much. My name is Robin Martin. I'm with Rebuilding Together Broward County. We're a national organization.
Yeah, sure.
I appreciate that what you shared today included home preservation loans. Can you share a little bit more about your viewpoint on the importance of housing repairs and modifications and maintaining affordable housing?
And this will be our last question, by the way. Thank you.
Yeah, I also have to go. I got to go home this week. So it's critically important. You know, the challenge is, especially while we're in this environment like Jesse talked about, where we're just not producing enough. And I think that will change. I'm very confident that's going to change, but probably not for 10 years in any real degree. It's going to be, you know, zoning changes are going to be the key that's going to drive that and other things. But the point is, until that happens, we have to preserve. And I don't know if Michelle has heard this story before. I don't usually tell it quite as publicly, but we're among friends. One of the reasons I left Enterprise when I left in 2000 was because we were celebrating that year having done, I think, our 100,000th home. And that same year, 250,000 units were lost from the housing stock. 1 year! 250,000 were lost in that entire, whatever it was, 15 years of Enterprise. We had done 100,000. I was like, this ain't working, friends. Like, this is not solving the problem that I personally want to solve. You know, it may be doing some good, you know? And so the preservation of what's already there is critical. The real challenge I've seen with it, as I'm sure you have too, for the homeowner, there's no place to go to get help like I talk about in Groundbreak. And then very few rebuilding together. And when Gary Officer was there for years, I don't know if you knew Gary, but Gary was Enterprise, wasn't it? Was Gary at Enterprise, or we just knew him there? But what in multifamily, the challenge is, like they call it NOAA, it's like how can we preserve naturally occurring affordable housing? But it's all grossly undercapitalized when they purchase it. So people just buy the deferred maintenance, and then it becomes a nonprofits problem 5 years in. And so we have huge challenges in that, but preservation is critical.
Thank you so much, Ben. One more time for Ben Heck, please.
Thank you.
Have a safe trip home.
Thank you.
And we're gonna break.